Hey there, how are ya? Wanted to do a short video on how to build SCX Shocks, what I call the right way. Uh, Last video I did actually came out, I built all four of them, came out to be 50 minutes long, and YouTube says it's too long to upload. So, we're going to try to do this consolidated, give you a good basic rundown of how I've been building SCX Shocks for the last I don't know, I've been doing rock crawling 12, 13 years now, since 2007. Started using SCX Shocks, around 2010, 2009, 2010. On the hunt for weight, trying to reduce weight, take 6-pound rigs down to 4-pound rigs. This is the way to do it. And back in the day, we were using low-C shocks. They were 4-inchers. This is a capper shock, but gives you an idea. We used those, and we went down to SCX. Problem with SCX is they come with the orange O-rings that we know they just don't seal. They're a pain. It's hard to keep oil in them. There's not much for a seal on the top cap. So along the roads of finding these, we found, I know myself, started using bladders. These are HPI bladders from the old, forgot what car they're from. Jake started using, he found that the Mini E Revo bladders work, and that's what pretty much the majority of us use, just because they're readily available. So I'm going to build a couple of shocks for Sporty that I'm kind of playing around with, toying around with some design ideas and whatnot. Got bored and wanted to tinker. But so the SCX shocks, they can be great. They really are. I mean, like I said, I've been using them now for the last 10 years at least. And you know, I battle through the typical leaks and the rebuilds and torn bladders and whatnot, but over the last, 5, 6 years, gotten pretty good, kind of changed the way I do things on them. And recently I found, last year, I noticed that Vanquish, through their INCISION line, was making bladder kits for their scale shock, for their scale truck. I got in touch with Harley and asked him what the inside bore was on them, and he said it was the same. It's a 7mm bore. So I got excited. The kits come with, 7mm. Kits come with bladders. That was mainly what I was after. A little different style. I wanted to see if they were more durable, see how they changed the shock up. So I bought me a bunch of kits. They're only $5. It's actually pretty cheap. What I found though was the bladder fits inside the shock. It doesn't seal against the cap though, and if you can see it, reason being is the bladder OD is smaller than the shock. So when you tighten them down, you end up actually squishing the bladder in, and it doesn't seal. You end up riding the train of, SCX shocks leaking again. So that got backburned, and about 4 months ago, when I was doing my rebuilding my pro rig for pre-COVID, hope there's a season, I said, you know what, let me try the O-rings that come in those kits. And the O-rings are actually X-rings. And the reason X-rings, like Traxxas uses X-rings in their big bores, and the reason X-rings work better for a lot of people is it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an X-ring. I know the camera won't show this, but in the middle there's a groove. Compared to your typical orange O-ring, you basically have one seal, and you're relying on the O-ring being squished to really hold that seal. Your seal is basically the center of that orange O-ring. On an X seal you get 2 seals, inside and outside of it. So with that groove in the middle, you have a sealing edge on the top or bottom, whatever you want to call it, and the opposite side. Both outside edges make a sealing seal. The inside does around the shaft as well. This just helps the shocks stay with oil in them. So let's get started on this before I end up dragging this out to a 50-minute video. So I'm using, you see the yellow piston, I'm using the Craze Build Tuner piston set. They're different variations of valving, depending on what you're after, rebound, compression, and whatnot. They fit right on an SCX shaft. They fit right in the body, nice and smooth. There's no hang up. They're machine Delrin, CNC machine Delrin, dyed different colors, so you can actually just look in your shock and catch a color and know which piston you got. Alright, so let's get started on this. First we're going to take a clean body, and what some guys will do is they'll stack the O-rings inside the body, they'll stack them up, they'll screw the cap down, drip a little oil, and then they'll fidget around, try to find the hole, and the piston gets a little stuck, and they're pushing it through. Not the proper way to do it. Reason being is once that O-ring is tightened down, it's actually compressed, and the inner hole is smaller. It's looking for something to grip around. And you push this shaft through that O-ring, and you catch those threads and that little bit of a lip on the bottom, especially if your shaft is marred at all, you're going to tear those O-rings. Those O-rings will not seal anymore. You're going to be back on the Facebook ban of SCX Shocks suck and they leak and I did everything right, but it's the shock's fault. Really, it's not. So what you want to do is no O-rings in the bottom. You're going to take this shaft and piston and you're going to put it in. You're going to take your first X-ring and slide it on just gently. You don't have to force them, they will slide on their own. Keep the black spacer that comes out of your stock SCX shock. You will need these. That spacer actually just makes up a little bit of space inside so that the O-ring's got some room to get pinched down around and form its seal. So, O-ring, shim, O-ring. Green slime, definitely a must. What this stuff does is it actually dries on the seals, and it's just like anyone who's done plumbing or pneumatic and have used Teflon tape or goop, it's the same thing. It's just an extra layer of sealant around edges. So you don't have to use much. I used a little bit too much that time. You can put it on the O-rings and just kind of bat it around with your fingers. Nothing major, a little slimy. Something else that I like to do is, your shaft is dry, there's no oil on it. You could put green slime on it, you could do that if you want. I just take a little bit of oil that I have. Just drip it on the shaft. Kind of run the O-rings through it with your fingers. Just get the inside wet. That way when you're trying to seat them, it's nice and smooth. So, cap is plastic. You're going to put it on. Keep the shaft from going through, because again, you don't want the shaft to pop through the O-rings and have to pull it back through. You risk tearing them. So, little finger on the back side. Push it until it stops. And you just start screwing the cap down. Catch a couple threads. Kind of move that shaft in and out. Move that oil around on those O-rings inside. Move that green slime around, whatever you got on there. Get that shaft a little slick so it slides nice and easy. Tighten down a little bit more. You may start to see some green slime poking out the top of the hole. But no big deal. It's got to go somewhere. You don't want to crank these down. Just finger tight. Finger tight till they stop. Keep working that shaft a little bit. Just get those O-rings kind of seated correctly inside. Let's see. Work it back and forth. Also, it's good to do because then you can feel if there's any hitches with the shaft in line. You can feel if there's any hitches inside the body. It's a plastic body. It could be molded wrong. You won't know until you go to put it on the truck, and then it doesn't. You compress it and it goes down hard, or it doesn't come back up because something's not lined up right. So again, just finger tight. It's plastic. It'll warp, cause you to leak, and you'll be complaining about shocks again and saying it's their fault and not yours. And that's not the right way to explain it. So, now one important thing when building SCX shocks, not many people talk about, is limiters and bladders. I prefer not to run internal limiters. I don't want to be pulling my shocks apart just to change a limiter inside. I need a little bit more articulation. I got too much limiter. I got a 6 mil limiter. Let me go down to a 4 mil. Now I got to tear the whole shock apart, drain all the oil, pull the bottom, pull the shaft, change it, put it back in, re-bleed it, risk tearing a bladder, risk tearing an O-ring. It's just a pain in the nutsack for it. So what I run is just a small limiter on the outside, and these are actually about 0.19, 0.20 limiters, which is about generally what I run. They're actually just wheel spacers I use for my 3-piece wheels. And I slide it on the shaft. Without this limiter, when you push this shaft all the way up so that the threads just hit the bottom of that cap, your piston is at the top. Any bladder you put in this, I can guarantee you are going to tear if you don't run an external limiter. You can see there that the bladder is on top of the piston. There's no room for it to go. So if I were to even see how it pushes the piston out, the shaft out, that's because I'm pushing down on the O-ring. When that's all sealed up and that bladder's got nowhere to go, you're pushing against it with an E-clip. That E-clip can tear it back to a leaky shock. So, what I do, like I said, I'd say minimum 0.20 limiter on the outside. This one kind of got stuck on me. Give it a little twist. Go right in. Now with that on there, and let's put it right at the bottom, right at where the threads end, because that's where our shock end's going to go. And I go up and I touch. My piston is nowhere near the top of that shock. Shaft up, I can actually make that, the bladder sits right down there, and I can still see distance. I can still see air in between the two. I won't touch that bladder. Fully compressed, not even close to it. So I mean, even on that, I've got let's see, yeah, 22.22 distance between the top and the bottom, and I won't tear it. Now let me put the shock end on. I know most are going to say these are not shock pliers, these are wire dikes. I don't really own a set of shock pliers because I use these. Just grab the top of the threads. You're not going to damage it. Grab the top of the threads. Even if you grab a little bit of the shaft down at the bottom, your limiter is going to cover it. You're not going to do any damage. Tighten the shock bottom up. If you grab your shaft way up in the middle, anywhere in the middle, pair of pliers even, whatever, you're gonna score it, and then you're definitely gonna damage your O-rings, and it won't be the shock's fault. So not a recommended tool, but you know, it's like I said, something I've been doing for quite a few years. So there we go, we're all together. Let's go. Alright, so oil, brand doesn't matter. We're rock crawling. We're not doing 3-second oval lap times. We're not doing, you know, 9-second touring car lap times. We're not running 50 miles an hour, jumping over jumps and whatnot. Shock oil doesn't matter. See what your local hobby shops got. Support them. Don't waste your time ordering shock oil online. You're paying more in shipping than what the oil costs. Alright, so 42.5. I don't really have an opinion of what oil you should run. I'll never say what you should run. This is just out of preference. When I look at oils, and I build my trucks, I kind of know what they all, you know, for the most part, they all feel like. Depending on what type of truck I'm building, a pro rig or a shafty rig, my weight range, you know, I kind of have a go-to range that I start with, and then, you know, tune and set up from there and see what they need. I will say generally we like to run a little heavier weight in our rear shocks versus our front shocks, and the reason being for that is my theory, criticize it what you want, is a shock is most effective when it's standing up, perpendicular to the arch that the suspension creates. The more you lay a shock down, the less effective it is, meaning the less effective the oil inside and your spring rate is going to be. As far as spring rates, the way I think of it is the more you lay it down, you create a falling spring rate. So if your springs are rated at 0.71, however it is, inch-pounds or pounds per inch or whatever it is, can't really remember off the top of my head, that spring is rated for it at pretty much perpendicular to a flat surface, 90 degrees to a flat surface. Now as you lay that shock down, that spring is going to feel a little softer as it goes through its arc. It's falling, it's softening itself up. The spring isn't, but the way, I don't know how to really explain it, the way it all reacts is the spring is actually, you're using less of the spring, let's say that, because now you're starting to pivot on the shock's fulcrum, which is the cap mounted to the chassis. That's its fulcrum. That's where it's going to pivot. So, in the rear of our trucks, we tend to go heavier, excuse me, to slow the shock down. Kind of stiffen it up, so to say, in layman's terms. You want to slow it down, stiffen it up, kind of use the oil as a little extra to the spring. So springs, in real basic thinking, springs are your ride height. Springs control where your truck sits. If the shock is mounted here and you put a spring on it that sits the shock here, your truck sits at a height. If you take preload off of the spring, it sags a little bit. Your ride height goes down. Springs also, yes, with preload and whatnot, you change the tension of them, the force that they have. You apply tension down on them, which is actually causing the spring to do what it's supposed to do and apply force in the opposite direction. You know, just you try to push it together, it's fighting back against you. Soft oil and a hard spring, it's going to take a lot of force to push that spring down. The oil's going to let it go, but it's going to take a lot of force. Now with those of us who run light trucks, feather lights, 3-pound, 4-pound range, we need that oil to be light to let the shock move smoothly and easily. We want our weight to transfer and move around on that truck easily. We want the axles to move easy. a 6-pound truck with light oil, that's a lot of weight going to get transferred very quickly with a light oil. Vice versa, a 4-pound truck running 60 weight oil in the front, because that's what a 6-pound truck may run, that shock's not going to want to move. There's not enough weight to push against it. It's going to be hard. So it's kind of hard for me to explain. I'm not really not an engineer on a lot of things, or really know how to explain them in a technical aspect of it. I'm more of a on the spot type, try to explain it. So anyway, back to a little thicker oil in the rear. Like I said, we want to try to just slow that rear shock down, and we do that because we tend to run the rears at more of an angle than the fronts. It's an excellent tuning tool, shock angle, because just 5 degrees in shock angle can change the way that axle feels, from being laid down so much that when it gets halfway it just washes out, and you'll see the back of your truck collapse and your shock doesn't move. You totally have no use of your shock at that point. If your shocks are laid down that much that they stop compressing and the rear end is still moving, the shock is useless to you. All that weight that shock is transferring in the opposite direction is lost. It's just going to simply disappear on you. Example is, you're climbing up to something and the front comes up and the rear's going down, and it seems like they're flowing evenly together, and then all of a sudden the rear just washes out on you. All that weight that you were dispersing virtually evenly just collapsed on that rear. You have no weight up here. So that's why I'm not a big fan of guys who really lay their shocks down. Going with a thicker oil can help you battle that, because it'll slow that shock down. It's like running a heavier spring, in theory. So most guys, that's what they'll do. They'll leave the oils alone. They don't play with the oils. They build the shocks. They're like, hey, they're not leaking. Everybody said run 35 weight, 40 weight in the rear. That's what I'm going to run. Oh, well, my rear end, it just collapses. I'm going to go up a spring. It's a Band-Aid. It'll tell you what you want to know. It'll show you that, yes, your shock is too soft, but in my opinion, it's not the right way to do it. Put the other spring back on. Change that shock angle. Stand that shock up a little bit. You'd be surprised. Stand it up a little bit. Maybe add a little bit of preload to it. I know on Drabtex and the track, we'll call them Traxxas big bores just so everyone knows. So on the Traxxas shocks, it's hard to add preload because you got, the spring is on there. You got to add O-rings to it and whatnot. You're kind of stuck in a spring range. There's not much you can do for tuning. SCX Shocks, that's one of the big things I like on the threaded bodies. Give it a couple twists. Just a little bit of preload can make a huge difference in your shock. SCX Shocks really are benefit for that because of the threaded bodies. Again, so thicker oil, we're just trying to slow that shock down. Provide a little resistance so that the front can collapse and the rear, is a little bit slower to keep that weight transfer forward versus just collapsing on the rear. Again, like I said, the way I explain things, I kind of go in circles on it. But so we're gonna put the oil in. We're gonna let them bleed. You don't have to put much oil in these while I'm filling this up. One thing I will touch on, so it's hard to compare SCX shocks. When people start talking oils, it's hard to compare an SCX shock to a Traxxas big bore. Reason being, again, in my opinion, is capacity. And I've tried it with Traxxas shocks. I've built them for rigs that I've built for people. I've helped other guys build them on their rigs. And you could take a 30 weight which is pretty much the standard weight anybody ships with all their shocks. So you take a standard 30 weight oil of any brand, and you take a stock 3-hole piston from a SCX shock, which I think is like a number 53, I think, and you put it in. You put that together. And you take a stock SCX shock, and you put 30 weight in that. Bleed them, close them up, and you will feel the difference. A big bore shock will feel very much stiffer than an SCX. Pretty much to get an SCX, to get a big bore to feel like an SCX shock, you would probably have to go with about, I don't know, maybe a 5-hole big hole piston, or 6-hole to let that oil flow through it, and its capacity. What I mean by that is, so here's a big bore. Let me get this cap off. Big bore body on the inside is 10 millimeter. Like I said, SCX is only 7 mil. So you got 3 millimeter more in diameter. There is more oil. See how I can explain this. There's more oil in a big bore, which means that piston has more area to move through, I guess I want to say. It has more oil to move through. Surface area, I really don't know how to explain that one, but you know, it's like I really don't know how to explain it, but it's capacity. You got more oil, you got a bigger piston, you have more surface area to move through a fluid. It's going to feel stiffer. So when you're talking with guys on, you know, oh, well, what oil do you run? And guys are telling you, oh, I run 30 weight, I run 35 weight. Well, if you're running SCX shocks, think about it. I could tell you SCX guys, we usually run around anywhere between 30 on a super light under 4-pound rig, all the way up to 60 in our rears. I know guys that are running 100 weight. Generally they're doing that with stock pistons, which are kind of look like flowers, but they're real flimsy. When you start playing around with a different valving like we offer, you play with weights more. The heaviest I've gone is on our triangle pistons, which have very low surface area to them. I've gone up to 1200 diff fluid, like we use in our touring cars. That's a triangle piston. As you can see, there's only 3 points of actual wall touching, and there's these 3 long sides are really going to let the fluid go through. So that was like 1200 CST diff fluid. And right now, even in my pro rig, I'm only running, I dropped down to 45 in my rears with, I really forgot what piston. So pistons matter too, but if you're comparing oils to people and you're like, oh, well, I'm running an SCX and you're running big bores and you're running 30, I should run 30, your shocks are going to be very soft. If you're building a brand new rig, I would recommend going, if they say 30, start at 45. Go 15 above what they're running, and feel out how they feel for you. See if they're too stiff, you know, once you get out on the trails and whatnot. So I got this one bleeding. Filling them up is pretty easy. So fill it up. That went a little too fast. They will fill up quick. You're going to push the shaft up and down a few times, and you're going to see air bubbles come up. That's what you want to get out, is the air. Give them some cycles. Let the oil work itself onto the shaft. Let the oil work itself below the piston. then just let them set. So now while that's bleeding, caps are pretty simple. You know, all you scale guys come through, they got this, you know, mock-up mini reservoir. Just take your trusty non-approved shock shaft pliers. Just literally, like I said, these are dull. Clip the reservoirs off. You can sand them with a Dremel, you want to make them look pretty. That's all you do. One of the other tricks to building with bladders that we do is we drill holes in our caps. So the one hole is to let excess oil out, and the other hole is to actually let air out. So what I do is 16th inch drill bit, hand drill will do fine. Drill one on the side, right on the side, right through it. And then I drill one in the small radius area up here, right down into the center of the cap. This one is going to let the air out of the bladder. The reason we want to do that is we don't want rebound. And what rebound is when you push your shock up, when you compress your shock and you let go, rebound will actually force that shock back out. Racing world, those guys run rebound. Kind of gives a shock a little different feel on full compression. Touring car, it's big in rebound. They actually do it in increments, like 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter, and they set all 4 shocks up. That, you know, the way they like them. I never liked rebound. I like riding on my oil and springs all the way down. I don't want to get pitched down into a corner and have that shock fighting back against me. You know, it's kind of unpredictable feeling for me. So rock crawling, I do the same thing. I don't run rebound in rock crawling. When I push that shock in, you know, it stays. It may come out a little bit, but the amount of space it comes out, I'm riding on my limiters anyway. I'm not going to feel it. I like the shocks just being consistent. I don't want to be on a course and, you know, tip the front end up and articulate the front end up, and then I got a shock fighting me and it's making my other shock collapse or binding my truck up. It's not what I like. So now comes the fun part. Shocks are bled. I wish I could show you the air that came out of these. You know, you can see it. Brand new shock will have air, and you just let it seep out. Shocks that you already have, if you're just rebuilding them, there's very little air, because unless you take the shaft out and spray the bodies, you're not going to get that oil at the very bottom out. So, like I said, I'm using the HPI bladders. These are a little, if you can find them, they're part number 87065. I don't remember what they came off of. They say like the Cup Racer was the car they came off of. You can still find them on eBay. These bladders are a little bit more durable than the Traxxas Mini E-Revo blue ones. But they also do give you a different feel. These bladders, now that I'm talking, you know, just talked about rebound, these will actually give you a little bit of rebound. I don't have any Mini E-Revos, that's why I'm not using them, but I also took that into account when I was building them. So we're just going to shaft all the way up, like you just saw me do. Drop the bladder on the top of it. Let that oil seep out. Crap, you know what I forgot to put on this was... let's take that bladder off for a minute. I forgot to put some shock spacers on. There's a ton of these variations out there. These are Delrin that I've made for myself. So we need these on there for shock preload and spacing. Fish's Crawler Parts makes some nice carbon fiber ones that you can use with the stock screw down pieces. Maybe do I want to use those? You know what? No, I don't want to use those. These Delrins I've had for years. But again, Fish's Crawler Parts makes out of carbon fiber. He actually sells a nice whole setup, SCX Shocks, where you can, buy the whole shock with a nice printed spring cup and carbon fiber spacer and a nice collar. Everybody loves carbon fiber. So let's re-bleed it, push that oil up, let's drop that piston back on it, kind of just let it sit on its own, let it push its own oil out. And this is the exciting part, because this is where it becomes messy and kind of crucial to building these correctly. So at this point, you're not just going to take the cap, screw it on. This is actually good to know too for building your big bores, to make sure you don't tear a bladder. I know some guys will put them in and then they'll screw them down and they're like, oh, the oil will come out. No, it won't. You're just pushing the bladder up. You're building a terrible shock. So bladder's sitting fine. You're going to pull down on your shaft, and you're going to watch as you pull down. See the bladder just pop back up. You're going to see that bladder collapse. What you're doing is you're forming that seal. Now with the HPI, I can pull all the way down. With a Traxxas shock, you cannot pull that shaft all the way down without usually sucking the bladder in. So you pull about halfway. You see it's formed a seal. It's not coming back up. Take your cap with the holes drilled in it and give it a couple of reverse turns to make sure you're seated on the threads. Anyone who's assembled plastic stuff before knows that. Give it a couple of turns. Don't tighten it down yet. A couple of turns to get it started, and just push that shaft all the way down. You may see some oil come out of the side. That's good. It's bleeding off the excess oil. And then just slowly tighten it up. You don't have to go super tight. Remember, it's plastic. The bladder will collapse inside. You see I got a little bit of rebound. That's the rebound that these bladders give. It's not something I like, but I can handle it. The trick is we had no oil come out of this top hole. If you have oil come out of this top hole, that means normally the bladder just got sucked inside. You tightened it too much and it just squished itself inside the piston. Usually you can save it. You just take it apart, wash your cap out, and redo it. I'm going to try to get that rebound out, so I'm going to loosen it up. I'm going to try to push that up. I got a little bit more oil out. I'm going to tighten it down again. And I did. I got a little bit of rebound out of it. Right now I'm just riding on the air from the bladder. But again, I got no, that's fine. No oil out of the top. That shock is built perfect. Like I said, I've been using these VP bladders, these VP rings, for since the beginning of the year. Built my Pro on them, and let me grab that. These they're 5 months old. I don't know how well you can see it, but there's no leak. I've honestly never had an SCX shock that's gone 2 months without leaking. Trying different things and everything, so definitely highly recommended using the X rings on these. And I'm not building them any different than I have over the years, besides the X rings. I haven't changed any of my technique. This is the way I've always built them. Like I said, I've been running them for 10 years now. Now I gotta clean it off. I use brake clean. Not recommended all the time. Be careful what you get. Red can CRC, anything red can, stay away from. It's actually very bad for the plastic. it will over time eat it away and soften it, or just make it brittle to where it cracks. Green can stuff, I don't like it because of the smell, but it's what I have. And generally what I do is I just spray them down over a trash can, spray them outside, someplace well ventilated, and just let them dry on their own. Don't try to wipe them off. Sometimes, depending on the plastics, you'll actually smear the plastic, put smear marks in it. It just looks like crap. So again, we're going to push the shaft all the way down, compress it all the way, right up against the bump stop. We're going to drop the bladder on top, a couple of love taps just to get it to seat. Pull it slowly all the way out. And then take your cap, a couple of easy lefty-loosey turns. You can kind of probably just saw my hands just wiggle. That was the cap sitting on top of the thread square. Kind of get it started and slowly compress the shock and let the oil and air just seep out the side. Keep it compressed, slowly tighten it up, let that extra oil come back out again. Tighten it till that one's actually good. There was no rebound on that one. Oh, there's a little bit. So we're going to pull that shaft out. We're going to loosen it. We're going to push that shaft back up. Got a little bit more bleeding out. That's what we wanted. And again, we're going to tighten it. Let's cycle it. Yeah, I got about the same amount of rebound, just a millimeter. It's livable. And I got no oil out of that top hole. I can guarantee you that unless I change my oils, after seeing what my pro rig has been running, what, I said 5 months now, 4 months, I haven't had a leak at all. I'm going to spray this one off. When you're spraying your shocks down, try not to, I put the shock upside down, so, and I did this off camera. I spray it like this. Try not to get anything down the shaft. You don't want whatever you're using to get on your O-rings. It's going to wash the oil off. It's going to wash the green slime out. And silicone O-rings don't really like the cleaners. They actually will swell and create a tighter feeling shock. They'll swell up on the shaft to make it stiffer. Also, spraying it this way, upright, you don't want to get any of this inside the top of the shock. Upside down is the best, and just spray from this down. You're just trying to get the oil and crap that came out here, and it won't go in the top hole. Keep it away from the bladder. Same thing, they're silicone bladders. They will they'll swell up on you as well and cause you problems. Probably put you back into the I did everything right, but the SCX shocks are still leaking, they're garbage, blah blah blah. Technically, no, you didn't do it right, but and then just slowly, wipe off any excess spray that's still on there, any excess oil, make them look pretty, and wipe off the tops. And let's see, we still got no leakers. Yeah, I got no leak out of the top hole, so I know my bladder sealed. So I got a little bit of spray and whatnot up there. Let's see what this one does. Yeah, I got no oil out of the top there either, and that's 2 completely built SCX shocks that I can tell you I'm going to put on my rig and not be worried about. I'm going to know that in a month's time I'm not having to rebuild them. They're not going to be leaking everywhere. I'm going to keep my oils and it'll be more consistent. My whole box of parts there. And that's it. I hope some people learn stuff. Again, INCISION, Vanquish's parts. They're the part number IRC 00212. They're only $5. Like I said, the bladders, you won't use them. They won't work. If you get them to work, great. They also come with the little black cap O-rings. You won't use those. You're just going to use the X-rings. You get 2 X-rings. You get 4 X-rings per package. So for $10, you could do all 4 of your SCX Shocks. It's worth it. And I believe SCX Shocks are still worth it to this day. A lot of tuning ability, spring variations, Losi Mini LST springs, RC Bros Silver springs, which are pretty much modeled after the Losi Mini T springs. The DravTech springs that Eric sells, those fit. So there's a lot of spring options out there for them. Having the ability to adjust preload, unlike a big bore where you're kind of locked into that, and then taking it apart and adding O-rings in the bottom. You know, anytime you got to take your shock apart, there's just a lot of variations that can happen. It's a lot of work, you know. I think for DravTech is really not well, for the big bore option style, you got what, super soft, medium, and hard, and guys generally stay around the soft range, I think. Like I said, I've built rigs with those shocks on them. They're a great shock. They work great. A lot of people love them, so it's not like, you know, the world is out there bashing them like SCXs. Other than that, just to be able to, you know, say, oh, well, need a little bit of preload, German collar. No big deal. It works out perfect that way. Be honest, I think 42 might have been a little stiff to go in these, but I'm shooting for an insane low weight on this truck. But simple rebuild, just like we just did. You literally take the cap off, drain the oil, let it sit for a little while, drain everything out that you can, fill them back up, put the bladder back on the way you just did it, cap it. Simple rebuild. But other than that, I don't have much more to say on it. I hope it helps some of you. And scale guys, absolutely worth using the shocks. Keep your CG down. And hope to see some of you on the trails, comps out there. And thanks for watching.